If you're ever in the mood to see some physical evidence of an attempted murder from 1918, then I suggest you head down to the Boston Harbor and hop on this ferry and ride the ferry for about 45 minutes to this island, which features an old United States Army fort. And once you arrive at the island, you can walk towards the fort, past the antique guns, up the stairs, through the many cavernous hallways and abandoned rooms, and eventually, with enough wandering, you may find yourself in front of this rather unassuming little doorway. Just one of dozens and dozens scattered throughout the fort. This doorway, though, is special because if you move the doormat lying in front of the entrance, then you'll find an oddly circular crack in the walkway. And believe it or not, that crack is evidence of a 108-year-old attempted murder. Let me tell you the story. The whole thing started way back in the spring of 1918, when the fort was still in active use. At the time, a unit of freshly enlisted soldiers was training on the island when one of the new privates began to develop a rather intense hatred for his captain. A mortal and deadly hatred, in fact. The captain, apparently oblivious to the danger he was in, continued on his daily routine as normal. Like clockwork, every day at just about the same time, he would walk along this path, through this stone archway, and out into the central courtyard of the fort. On one fateful day, though, just as the captain was walking through the doorway, a dark shape whizzed past his eyes and smashed into the walkway just a few inches in front of his feet. High above the surprised captain, perched along the stone like a gargoyle, was that disgruntled private who had just tried to cave in the head of his superior with an antique cannonball dropped from the top of the archway. By some miracle, the private had mistimed the drop and hit the stone walk instead of the captain. From what I can tell, the details of what happened to the private afterwards are hazy, but the evidence of his crime is unmistakable. Over 100 years later, a crack in the walk left by a cannonball infused with murderous intent. And that is just the first of a whole series of interesting and bizarre anecdotes that I'd like to share with you today. Welcome to Fort Warren, an old stone sentinel with many, many secrets. Although this fort was either under construction or in active service from 1833 all the way up through the end of World War II, undoubtedly its busiest years came during the U.S. Civil War. So let's start our second story in 1863, when the fort was actually predominantly under use as a military prison for captured Confederate soldiers and officers. On August 18th of 1863, 6 prisoners squeezed their way out of one of these windows at the back of the fort and snuck down to the shore of the island under cover of darkness. Their plan was to swim about a half-mile through the Boston Harbor to nearby Lovell's Island, where they hoped to steal a boat and make their getaway. Unfortunately for the prisoners, though, the plan didn't quite go as expected. 2 of the men drowned in the icy waters of the harbor, 2 more stayed on the shore of the island where they were caught later that night, and the last 2 actually did complete the swim to the other island, where they stole a boat and sailed around the New England coast for a few days before they were recaptured near Portland, Maine. If you ask me, though, the most interesting part of this story is not what happened to the men, but instead, it's the window that they escaped from. See, from this vantage point, it's kind of tough to tell exactly how big those openings are, But if we go inside the fort, then you can see that these are some pretty unique looking windows. They begin with a very large rectangular opening and then slowly shrink down to a small slit in the stone. This is what's known as a musketry loophole, and the point of building an opening like this is to give gun-wielding soldiers a wide range of movement without exposing too much of their body. And just to really hammer home how incredible it is that 6 men actually squeezed through one of these things, I'm gonna go ahead and give it a shot myself. All right. Okay. So as you can see, I can't even get my head through it, let alone the rest of my body. And by the way, you might be thinking that the reason that the prisoners were able to squeeze through here was because they were like emaciated or something, because they weren't getting fed good food. But actually, the prisoners were fed pretty much the same stuff that the soldiers were fed. The real reason that prisoners were able to squeeze through this gap is because one really thin, tiny man realized that he could get through it, and then he scoured the entire prison population and found 5 other tiny guys, the tiniest guys he could find, and recruited them for his special mini soldier prisoner squad that was just happened to be naturally slight enough to fit through this teeny gap here. And real quick, before we move on, I should mention that I actually got most of my information on the window escape story from a magazine article from 1892 that was actually written by one of the Confederate soldiers that participated in the escape. And in that article, the soldier also mentions a second escape attempt that isn't nearly as well known. Apparently, soon after the prisoners were recaptured and returned to the fort, they actually tried to escape again by removing bricks from a chimney so that they could enlarge the opening and sneak out through the top. But after several months of work, the prisoners realized that the fort actually posted a guard every night right at the top of the chimney. And so all their work ended up being for nothing. I really wanted to see if I could find this chimney and look for evidence of the soldiers removing bricks, but I walked around the section of the fort that the prisoners were held in for a long time with no luck, until I eventually looked up at the ceiling and saw a suspiciously chimney-shaped hole. So I went to the top of the fort in the same spot, and there is the missing chimney. I guess the entire bottom portion was removed at some point in the last 150 years or so. So unfortunately, there is no evidence remaining of the ill-fated chimney escape plan. All right, let's move on to the next anecdote. Have you ever heard this song? John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his heart goes marching on. Sorry, I'm not that good a singer. That is John Brown's Body, a popular marching anthem with Union soldiers during the Civil War. I messed up the lyrics at the end there. It's supposed to be soul goes marching on, not heart, but the message is pretty much the same. John Brown, the famous abolitionist, died in 1859, but his soul keeps marching on. His ideas and his memory are alive and well amongst the Union Army. You also may have heard an alternative version of the song that sounds like this.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is tramping out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His troop is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
That is the Battle Hymn of the Republic, a much more famous version of the song that uses the same melody, just with new lyrics that don't contain any references to the somewhat controversial figure of John Brown. That battle hymn version was written by Julia Ward Howe in November of 1861, but the original John Brown version was actually created first right here in Fort Warren by a group of soldiers stationed on the island. Supposedly, amongst the men was a very jovial Scotchman who was named John Brown. And because he shared a name with the abolitionist, Mr. Brown was constantly teased by the rest of the battalion. If Mr. Brown was late falling into line, for example, the other soldiers might say, "Oh, come on now, John Brown, you can't be late if you want to free the slaves." Or they might say, "Hey, wait a minute, that can't be John Brown. Everybody knows that John Brown is dead." And then another soldier might chime in and say, "Yes, sir, John Brown is dead indeed. His body lies moldering in the grave." And so, over time, the joke continued to grow and grow until eventually the whole battalion was singing a special song about John Brown set to the melody of an old Methodist hymn. And that song spread like wildfire. Although the tune started mostly as a joke about John Brown the soldier, the men of the fort soon found themselves singing it earnestly about John Brown the abolitionist. There is something peculiarly captivating about the plain and homely character of the old anti-slavery martyr, they said. And apparently, the rest of the Union Army agreed, because the song soon began to circulate far beyond Fort Warren. The men of the fort started singing it to other battalions, who then in turn sung it themselves, and before long, John Brown's body had seized the Union Army with fascinating power. No song of the war became more popular. Sadly though, John Brown the Scotchman, the original soldier who kicked the whole thing off, did not survive the Civil War. He drowned in the waters of the Shenandoah River near Front Royal, Virginia, back in June of 1862. But like the song says, his soul is marching on. All right, here's something pretty cool. It may be hard to believe nowadays, but at one time, Fort Warren actually held a billiards room, a bar, and even a theater. With how stripped down the fort is nowadays, sometimes it can be difficult to tell what each of these empty rooms used to be used for, but then other times it's pretty obvious. Like this, for example, is the Fort Warren Kitchen and Bakery. Right here is where most of the island's food was produced. And it is also the site of one of my very favorite stories. See, during the Civil War, a common meal on the island was bean soup. And the soldiers of Fort Warren absolutely hated that bean soup. They thought it was watery and bland, and many of the soldiers even surmised that the reason that the soup was so tasteless was because it was only made with one single bean. Not that each bowl only contained a single bean, and not even that each pot of soup contained a single bean, but that long ago the fort's chefs had made a giant batch of bean soup using exactly one bean, and ever since then that original bean has just been used and reused whenever it was time to make some more soup. And apparently, some of the soldiers felt bad for that poor little bean. They thought that after sticking it out for all those years and contributing to all those bowls of soup, that little bean finally deserved a rest. And so, they prepared a funeral. One of the soldiers succeeded in finding the very original bean, which had been the source of all the soup thus far furnished, and it was determined to bury that bean with proper ceremonies. And so, the men prepared the bean for burial and headed out from the fort's kitchen in a mock funeral procession. As they passed their colonel's tent, the officer stuck his head out and asked what all the music and commotion was for. So the soldiers told him that they were off to bury the original bean from which all the fort's bean soup was born. And the colonel replied by saying, "Well, I think it's about time that we were rid of that bean." And so off went the funeral procession, and that little bean was buried somewhere upon this island, finally laid to rest after feeding a countless number of hungry soldiers. Rest in peace, little bean. You served your country admirably. If I knew where your grave was, I'd be sure to leave some flowers. All right, so as you might expect, Fort Warren has its fair share of ghost stories, many of which again originated during the Civil War. Like, for example, once a sentinel returning from guard duty reported to his officer that a white figure had twice passed in front of him. When pressed further about the incident, the guard admitted that he didn't stop or approach the figure because he feared it was a ghost. The officers on the island weren't quite as confident though, so they ordered a search of the fort, which thankfully turned up that no prisoners had escaped and no intruders had penetrated the island's defenses. Of course though, the fort commanders weren't exactly happy about spending so much time and manpower on a mostly unnecessary search. So the next night, a new order was posted at the guardhouse. And that order promised severe punishment for any sentinel that allowed a ghost to pass by without challenge or arrest. As funny as that is though, the real main event is yet to come. One Fort Warren ghost story stands far above all the rest. The tale of the Woman in Black, undoubtedly the island's most famous phantom. There are many different versions of this story, but the most common iteration goes a little like this. At one point during the Civil War, a newlywed Confederate captain was captured and confined at Fort Warren. Somehow, the captain managed to send a message to his new bride, and before long, the young woman was traveling up north on a journey to free her husband. When she arrived in Massachusetts, she found a Confederate sympathizer in Boston, borrowed a small ship, and headed out towards Fort Warren under cover of darkness. The woman also brought along a pistol for protection, and she dressed herself in men's clothing, presumably so she could try and blend in if she happened to draw any attention. After passing through the Boston harbor undetected, the woman successfully made it to the island, found her husband's cell block, and used a sewer grate to sneak inside the fort. Once the husband and wife were reunited, they rejoiced and then promptly got to work trying to dig their way out of the fort. Unfortunately for the couple though, their scheme was soon discovered. They made too much noise trying to dig out the tunnel, and before long, the newlyweds found themselves cornered by guards. In a last-ditch effort to escape, the young woman attempted to fire her pistol at a Union colonel, but the weapon malfunctioned, exploded, and killed her husband. Soon after, the woman herself was captured and sentenced to execution for her crimes. However, before she died, the new widow made one last request. She wanted to die in women's clothing because, remember, she had dressed like a man en route to the island. After searching the fort, the Union soldiers found some black robes used for costuming in the fort's theater productions, and so off went the young woman to her death wearing a flowing black dress. As the legend goes, for decades afterward, the men of the island claimed to see a ghostly figure in black stalking the depths of the fort, and sometimes even attacking soldiers. Some say that the woman in black would throttle unsuspecting guards and throw rocks across rooms. And I even found one newspaper article from 1964 that claims that in this spot back in 1960, the woman in black tackled a quartermaster and tried to throw him off the top of the fort. I tried to line up that picture with how the same spot looks today, but I had a hard time finding the exact place. I think it's this, but I'm not 100% sure. And lastly, before we move on to the next story, we simply must visit the dungeon of the Lady in Black. This right here is the section of the fort that housed the lady's husband, and supposedly it is also the place where you are most likely to encounter the ghost. So let's go take a look. It's the end of the dungeon, I guess. All right, you want to hear some good old-fashioned 19th century humor? This here is the island's northern tip, one of its only sandy beaches. Once, back in the 1880s, a writer and his friends sailed by this spot and noticed a soldier marching up and down along the shores. The writer turned to his friend and remarked on how silly it was for the army to assign a man to just walk back and forth on the beach during a time period when an attack was very improbable. The man's friend, though, disagreed. He said, "What do you mean? That soldier is protecting government property. Just let a clam stick his head up anywhere and that guard will shoot it right off quicker and scat. Gotta protect government property, you know." Next up, I'd like to tell you about the Battle of Bug Light. Back during the Civil War, there used to be a lighthouse sitting right about here in the Boston Harbor. The lighthouse was visible from Fort Warren and somewhat resembled an insect standing on spindly legs, and so many people referred to the structure as Bug Light. On one particularly stormy evening, the soldiers of Fort Warren heard gunfire coming from the direction of Bug Light. They couldn't see anything through the thick rain, but they had heard rumors that Confederate ships were planning an attack on the Boston Harbor. So the entire fort was aroused, and every man was called to his battle station. As the entire fort stood at attention, the distant booming continued, echoing through the night, until finally orders were given to launch a small boat in the direction of Bug Light, a reconnaissance mission meant to locate the cause of the explosions. So the men rowed out into the water, and then a half hour later they returned and reported that the keeper of Bug Light had been trying to shoot rats with a shotgun. So the whole fort was put on red alert due to pest extermination. And speaking of rats, let's head inside the fort for another rodent-related story. An old Fort Warren legend tells the tale of a Union soldier who spent the day in Boston and then returned to the island with his hair slicked down with barber's oil. Supposedly, the man went to bed that night, dreamed that mosquitoes were biting his head, and then awoke to find that the fort's rats had eaten all the hair off his head. The rodents had been attracted to the oil and essentially mowed the man's scalp like grass. Apparently, the poor soldier was bald for the rest of his days. Next up, this is the Demi-Lune, a circular-shaped building that houses evidence of yet another escape attempt. See, if you look at the windows in the Demi-Lune, you'll notice that they mostly all look the same. Long, rectangular openings, similar to the ones that we looked at earlier, except for this one, which looks a little different. Upon closer examination, we can see that this particular window has been closed up with a granite block and an iron bar. As you can probably guess, the reason for these renovations has to do with our escape attempt. Way back in October of 1863, a deserter from a Union regiment was sentenced to serve 2 years confinement in the Demi-Lune on Fort Warren. But apparently, the deserter did not want to serve out his full term. And so, what he did was light newspapers on fire, shove them into this window, wait for the stone to get red hot, and then throw water onto the window, which rapidly cooled and cracked the granite. Over time, the soldier eventually created a large enough gap to squeeze through, so one night he made his escape out the window, swam to a ship in the Boston harbor, and was promptly captured by the ship's captain and turned over to the police. Of course, the army didn't want anyone else escaping through the broken window, so they sealed up the gap with a block of granite and an iron bar, both of which are still there today. All right, next up, I want to tell you about a map. This is a pictorial map of Fort Warren created in 1960 by a local historian named Edward Rowe Snow. Snow is a major figure in New England folklore history, a very prolific writer and collector of anecdotes. Snow's work is very interesting to read through because oftentimes he tells stories that appear in no other sources, and this map is no exception. There are 40 points of interest on this map that Snow recommends to the island's visitors, and each of these points comes along with an associated story. So what I want to do now is show you a few of these landmarks with the caveat that I'm not 100% sure that these stories are true. As far as I'm aware, Edward Snow is the sole source for these bits of information. Snow does often mention in his work that he has done a lot of archive work while researching Fort Warren, so it's very possible that he's just the only person to ever uncover these stories, but still, I thought I'd throw that warning in there just in case. So let's start things off right here. Snow's map tells us that there used to be a bowling alley in this part of the fort, and he also tells us that somewhere in this area is an old cistern that was closed up with bricks because in 1893, a group of 3 soldiers murdered another soldier by shoving him into the cistern. Snow even includes a little drawing of the incident. Apparently, no one noticed that the soldier was missing until a few days later when the water from the cistern began to taste strangely rancid. so the cistern was blocked off and hidden away. I'm not 100% sure where exactly the blocked off cistern is. There's a few places in the area that look like possible candidates, but if I had to pick one spot, it would be this one. That certainly looks like a closed off doorway to me. Next, Snow also has several markers on his map for mysterious sounding places that I could not find today, like the unexplored tunnel, the mysterious inner stairs, and the Dome of Mystery. I really wish I could get into that last one, but as far as I can tell, it's somewhere beyond this chain link fence and thick greenery. According to Snow's map, the Dome of Mystery has something to do with a haunted secret tunnel that was used by the infamous Woman in Black. And for the last stop that we'll be visiting on the map, let's head back to the Demi-Lune. At the top of the stairs leading down into the Demi-Lune is this metal post that's part of the stairway railing. And if you look real close at this post, you'll see two very small holes. According to Snow's map, these holes are actually bullet holes from an experimental firing of the first Springfield rifle ever made. In my opinion, this is far and away the most interesting detail on the entire map. Snow doesn't really provide much extra info here, and I couldn't find any other sources validating that these are actually bullet holes from the first Springfield rifle, but I just can't help but ask a bunch of questions anyway. Like, why was the first Springfield rifle tested on an army base on an island? And why did they decide to test the rifle by shooting holes in a fence railing? Honestly, I really hope that this story is actually true, because it's just kind of baffling to think about. I love this one. Why did they shoot the fence railing? All right, next up, I'd like to show you my favorite section of the entire fort. This portion is referred to as the Dark Tunnel, and in a moment, you'll see why.
Man, I should have brought a way stronger flashlight.
The highlight of the Dark Tunnel is a massive rectangular room with a circular ceiling. At one point, this room was an open courtyard, but now it is closed off and pitch black, save for a small opening in the roof that once accommodated a chimney. The echo in this room is absolutely stunning, at least 10 seconds of sustain. I spent probably half an hour in here just playing around with the reverberation.
I'm not sure how much you can even see. Hello? Holy cow, the echo in here is actually insane. This room is like exponentially more echoey than that other room already was. Like, I'm not sure if it picks up on camera or not, but you get like a solid probably 10 seconds of reverberation. What? John Brown's body lies alone in the grave. John Brown's body lies alone in the grave. John Brown's body lies alone in the grave, but his soul keeps marching on. I should add a new tier to my Patreon called the John Brown's Body tier, and if you sign up for it once a month, we all go to Fort Warren and we go to that pitch black tunnel and we all sing John Brown's Body together, the whole song.
Next up, this is the Central Courtyard or Parade at Fort Warren. Beginning in the early 1900s, the soldiers of Fort Warren held an annual field day right here on the parade. The field day featured standard events like a tug of war and a 100-yard dash and a hammer throw, as well as more specialized competitions like a musician's contest, an obstacle course that involved climbing through a barrel, and my personal favorite event, the equipment race. In this contest, each competitor starts off wearing their full military garb, and then they run across the parade shedding a piece of equipment or clothing every 10 yards. So you run 10 yards and then you discard your rifle, and then you run another 10 yards and you take off your gloves, and then another 10 yards and take off your ammunition belt, and so on and so forth until you reach the opposite side of the parade stripped of all equipment. And then you turn and run back, picking up all your belongings and putting them back on as you sprint across the parade. The soldiers were apparently very strict about this competition. One time in 1906, a first place finisher was disqualified because he accidentally put his hat on backwards. In addition to their field day, the men of Fort Warren also played team sports. They had a baseball team that was apparently pretty good, and a soccer team that was absolutely awful. Yeah, one time in 1905, the Fort Warren soccer squad visited the mainland to play a game against a local team from Massachusetts, and the Army boys got absolutely crushed. I found multiple newspaper articles covering this event, and each one tears the Fort Warren team to pieces. Just look at these quotes. The Fort Warren boys do not know how to play the game. They were no match for the local champions, and the game was a big disappointment. It was a farce from start to finish. The visitors put up the worst exhibition of any visiting 11 that ever appeared here, knowing absolutely nothing about the game. Fort Warren lost 5-0, but it could have been 100-0 if the other team had even bothered to try. Another reporter called the game one of the most miserable exhibitions of football that has ever been witnessed. Apparently, things got so bad that a couple of players from the opposing team actually switched sides and joined the Fort Warren team temporarily just to even the odds a little bit. All right, I got one last big story for you. So real quick, let's rapid fire go through a few small stories. Once, some soldiers were throwing bread at each other, and then an officer came into the room and they accidentally hit him in the face with a loaf of bread. This little corner of the fort used to hold a flower garden because soldiers, as a rule, are as fond of flowers as they are supposed to be of slaughter. A very common punishment back when the fort was still in operation was log duty. And log duty consisted of carrying a giant log back and forth across the parade for hours at a time. In April of 1896, exactly one person was imprisoned at Fort Warren. That person was a soldier who had been tried and convicted of general worthlessness, and his sentence was a few months imprisonment on the island and then a dishonorable discharge from the army. In February of 1862, the Union Army scored a major victory at Fort Donelson in Tennessee, and the men wanted to celebrate. So the fort's commanding officer pretended to have an appointment on the mainland so that he had an excuse to leave the fort so that the men could celebrate without having to worry about the boss breathing down their neck. What a nice gesture. But okay, I'd say it's just about time for our final story, perhaps the most famous of all the island's tales. In April of 1864, 2 deserters were executed on Fort Warren. The 2 men had been signing up for the army in various places around New England, collecting the bounty offered to new recruits, and then deserting the unit and moving on to the next military outpost. They had done this multiple times throughout the war, even going as far as dyeing their hair, using fake names, and recruiting other deserters to better maximize their profits. Quite literally, these 2 men had made desertion into an organized profiteering ring. Eventually, though, the 2 men were caught and sentenced to death in April of 1864. On the day of the execution, a few reporters went out to the island to witness the event. Here is their recollection. At 1:30 on the day of the execution, the 2 prisoners left their cells in chains and marched across the island, along with 20 men wielding rifles and a cart carrying 2 coffins. The 2 men were named Riley and Carpenter, and each man walked firmly, although they both looked a little pale. They gazed at the sun and the sky and the fort and everything before them with deliberate calmness. The fort's band began to play a funeral march as hundreds of soldiers and Confederate prisoners watched the proceedings from the fort windows. Eventually, the prisoners arrived at the chosen execution site, a patch of grass next to the demi-lune. Each prisoner kneeled while the fort's priest offered a prayer. Then they got up and stood behind their coffins. Both manifested slight uneasiness and nervousness. Carpenter noticed a ship passing by the island, and for a moment he watched it. Then he began to fidget in place, placing his hand in his pocket, then on his hip, then behind him. He spat in the grass several times. The charges were then read aloud to the prisoners, and the firing squad took their positions. Neither man said anything when given the opportunity to speak. The priest then shook each prisoner's hand and kissed them. Carpenter asked if his body was going to be buried on the island and seemed a little more calm when he was told no. Each body would be returned to the friends and family of the deceased. Both men then threw off their coats and hats, and Carpenter kicked his hat out of the way with his foot. A white bandage was placed over the eyes of each man. Then they knelt down and were shot and killed. And all that happened right here in this peaceful little spot. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.